In 1973, a promoter named Don Arden received a visitor at his London office who calmly explained that if Arden did not relinquish management of the Electric Light Orchestra, his children would be harmed and his body would never be found. The threat did not come from a rival manager or a disgruntled artist, but from associates connected to one of the most powerful organized crime networks operating inside the entertainment industry, a web that stretched from the jukeboxes of Depression-era Harlem to the glittering stages of Las Vegas and the executive suites of major record labels. How did the mafia gain such a stranglehold on popular music, and what did it cost the artists, the audiences, and the culture itself to break that grip? To understand how organized crime embedded itself so deeply into the fabric of the American music industry, you have to go back to the place where music and money first intersected at scale, the jukebox. In the early 1930s, the repeal of prohibition left thousands of mob-controlled speakeasies suddenly legitimate. These bars and clubs needed entertainment, and the coin-operated phonograph, soon to be called the jukebox, was cheap, reliable, and endlessly profitable. By 1940, there were over 300,000 jukeboxes operating across the United States, consuming more than half of all records produced in the country. Whoever controlled the jukeboxes controlled which songs the public heard. And it was the mob that controlled the jukeboxes. Families across New York, Chicago, and New Jersey carved up territories for jukebox distribution with the same precision they applied to gambling and loan sharking. The Genovese family dominated the New York metropolitan area. The Chicago outfit held the Midwest. In practice, this meant that if a record label wanted a hit, they needed their songs on those machines, and getting a song on a jukebox meant paying tribute to the men who owned them. This was more than a footnote in music history. It was the mechanism that shaped which artists became famous and which disappeared. Record labels began hiring intermediaries known as record promoters, men whose sole job was to get songs played. Many of these promoters were either mob-connected or paid protection to mob-connected distributors. The system created a shadow economy where payola, the practice of paying for airplay, became inextricable from organized crime. If you're watching this and you find yourself drawn to the hidden mechanics behind industries most people take for granted, consider subscribing. This channel exists to pull back the curtain on the real systems of power, the ones that don't make the official histories. Every video is built on documented events, and there is much more to uncover. The jukebox racket was only the beginning. By the late 1940s, a new frontier had opened, the nightclub circuit. Mob-owned venues were the backbone of live entertainment in America. The Copacabana in New York, the Chez Paris in Chicago, the 500 Club in Atlantic City. These were not just glamorous rooms where stars performed, they were cash-generating operations run by or for organized crime families. The Copacabana, perhaps the most famous nightclub in American history, was controlled by Frank Costello, the so-called prime minister of the underworld, through a frontman named Jules Podell. Podell was known for pounding his heavy pinky ring on the table when he was displeased, and artists who performed at the Copa understood implicitly that their bookings, their pay, and even the length of their sets were determined by men whose authority came from violence, not contracts. What made this arrangement so durable was that it offered something artists could not easily get elsewhere: exposure. In an era before television became ubiquitous, a residency at the Copa or one of its counterparts could make a career overnight. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Tony Bennett, all of them performed in mob-controlled venues during the critical early years of their careers. Sinatra's relationship with organized crime has been documented exhaustively, though its precise contours remain disputed. What is clear is that Sinatra's early career was aided by relationships with men like Willie Moretti, an underboss in the Genovese family who reportedly pressured Tommy Dorsey into releasing Sinatra from his contract in 1943. The story, later fictionalized in The Godfather, involved a visit to Dorsey's home and a suggestion that his signature on a release form would be preferable to the alternative. Whether a gun was literally placed to Dorsey's head, as legend holds, is uncertain, but Dorsey did release Sinatra for a fraction of his contractual value, and Sinatra's career trajectory changed overnight. Here is a detail that often gets lost in the Sinatra mythology. The mob did not simply help artists out of generosity or fandom. Every favor created a debt. Artists who owed their careers to organized crime were expected to perform at specific venues, to appear at private functions, and in some cases to serve as unwitting fronts for money laundering. The nightclub circuit was ideal for this purpose because live entertainment generated enormous amounts of cash that was nearly impossible to audit. A club could report inflated attendance figures, skim from the door, and wash money through ticket sales and bar receipts. The artist on stage was, in a very real sense, a laundry machine. By the mid-1950s, the mob's grip on the music industry had extended into a new and even more lucrative domain: radio. The Payola scandals that erupted in 1959 and 1960 exposed a system that had been operating in plain sight for years. Record promoters, many of them connected to organized crime, paid disc jockeys to play specific records. The most famous casualty was Alan Freed, the Cleveland disc jockey widely credited with popularizing the term rock and roll. Freed was indicted, convicted, and destroyed. But what the congressional hearings led by Orrin Harris did not fully expose was the organized crime infrastructure behind the Payola. Freed was a convenient scapegoat. He was loud, visible, and expendable. The men behind him, the distributors and promoters who channeled mob money into radio stations across the country, largely escaped scrutiny. Morris Levy, the owner of Roulette Records, is perhaps the most instructive example of what the Payola hearings missed. Levy was a towering figure in the music industry for more than 3 decades. He co-owned Birdland, the legendary jazz club on Broadway named after Charlie Parker, and he built Roulette Records into a label that released recordings by Buddy Knox, Jimmy Rogers, Tommy James, and dozens of others. He was also, according to FBI records and multiple court proceedings, a longtime associate of the Genovese crime family. Levy's method was as elegant as it was ruthless. He would acquire publishing rights to songs, often through intimidation or contractual manipulation, and then collect royalties for decades. Tommy James, whose hits Crimson and Clover and Mony Mony sold millions, later estimated that Levy owed him millions of dollars in unpaid royalties. James described the experience of being signed to Roulette as being simultaneously famous and broke, knowing that the man who controlled his money had connections that made legal challenges inadvisable. Levy was finally convicted of extortion in 1988, in a case involving the sale of cutout records to a distributor with ties to the Gambino family. He died in 1990 while appealing the conviction. The royalties he collected over his lifetime were never fully accounted for. Now consider a broader pattern. The mob did not merely skim profits from the music industry. It shaped the industry's structure in ways that persisted long after the mobsters themselves were gone. The independent promotion system, where labels paid outside promoters to secure radio airplay, was a direct descendant of the Payola networks built by organized crime. In the early 1980s, a new generation of independent promoters, most notoriously a network centered around figures like Joe Isgro and Fred DeCipio, dominated the promotion landscape. Isgro, a Philadelphia-born promoter, was reportedly responsible for getting records played on hundreds of radio stations across the country. His fees were enormous, and labels paid them because refusing to use independent promoters meant your records simply would not be played. In 1989, a federal grand jury indicted Isgro on 57 counts of payola, racketeering, and drug trafficking. The charges were eventually dropped or reduced, in part because a key government witness was discredited. But the investigation laid bare a system in which millions of dollars flowed from major labels through intermediaries and into a network that bore the unmistakable fingerprints of organized crime. Here is a number that illustrates the scale. In 1985, NBC News estimated that independent promoters collectively received between $60 and $80 million annually from the 6 major record labels. This was not pocket money. It was a structural cost baked into the economics of every major release. Labels knew, or strongly suspected, where the money went, but they paid because the alternative was commercial invisibility. The system was, in essence, a protection racket dressed up as marketing. The mob's influence was not limited to the business side. It reached into the creative lives of artists in ways that were sometimes bizarre and sometimes tragic. Consider the case of the Beatles' first American concert tour in 1964. The tour was promoted by Sid Bernstein, who booked the band into Carnegie Hall and later into Shea Stadium. But behind the scenes, the concert business in the 1960s was heavily influenced by mob-connected promoters who controlled venues, unions, and security. Artists who toured without the blessing of these promoters risked equipment sabotage, labor disputes, and worse. The Grateful Dead's manager, Rock Scully, later described encounters with mob-connected promoters who demanded a cut of concert revenues in exchange for allowing shows to proceed without incident. The Rolling Stones' disastrous Altamont concert in 1969 where a concert-goer was stabbed to death by Hell's Angels serving as security, was partly the result of the band's attempt to stage a free concert outside the established, mob-influenced concert promotion system. The lesson was clear: operating outside the system had consequences. Las Vegas deserves its own examination. By the late 1960s, Vegas had become the pinnacle of the live entertainment industry, and every major casino on the Strip had documented ties to organized crime. The Stardust, the Tropicana, the Flamingo. These were mob investments that used entertainment as a draw for gambling revenue. Artists who headlined in Vegas were paid handsomely, but the economics were distorted. Casinos could afford to overpay performers because the real money came from the gaming floor. This created a perverse incentive structure where artists became dependent on Vegas money, which in turn made them dependent on the men who ran the casinos. Elvis Presley's legendary residency at the International Hotel, later the Las Vegas Hilton, beginning in 1969, took place in a city where organized crime's influence was so pervasive that the Nevada Gaming Control Board spent years trying to purge it. Colonel Tom Parker, Presley's manager, was himself a compulsive gambler who lost millions at the very casino where Elvis performed. Some historians have argued that Parker's gambling debts effectively trapped Presley in a grueling performance schedule that contributed to his physical and psychological decline. The mob did not kill Elvis Presley, but the system the mob built helped create the conditions that destroyed him. The 1970s brought a shift. Federal law enforcement, armed with RICO statutes passed in 1970, began to systematically target organized crime's infiltration of legitimate industries. The music industry was not the primary focus, but it was repeatedly entangled in broader investigations. In 1975, the FBI launched an investigation into the relationship between MCA Records, one of the largest entertainment conglomerates in the world, and organized crime. MCA's president, Sidney Sheinberg, and its legendary founder, Lew Wasserman, were both scrutinized. The investigation centered on allegations that MCA had used mob-connected labor consultants to suppress union activity and that the company had relationships with organized crime figures dating back to its origins as a talent agency in the 1930s. A federal grand jury was convened, but no indictments were ultimately issued against MCA's top executives. The investigation, however, produced thousands of pages of documents that painted a picture of an entertainment industry where the line between legitimate business and organized crime was, at times, invisible. What made the mob's relationship with the music industry so resilient was that it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the street level, there were the enforcers who collected debts, intimidated competitors, and ensured compliance. At the mid-level, there were the promoters, managers, and distributors who served as intermediaries between the criminal world and the corporate world. At the top, there were the executives and investors who benefited from mob money and mob muscle without ever having to acknowledge the source. This layered structure meant that eliminating any single figure, whether it was Morris Levy or Joe Esgro or a local jukebox distributor, did not dismantle the system. It simply created a vacancy that was quickly filled. The crack epidemic of the 1980s introduced a new dynamic. As traditional Italian-American organized crime families lost influence due to federal prosecutions, new criminal organizations moved into the music industry. The rise of hip-hop coincided with a period when drug money was looking for legitimate investments, and the music industry, with its cash-intensive operations and its history of lax oversight, was a natural target. The story of Death Row Records, founded in 1992 by Suge Knight and Dr. Dre, is inseparable from the story of organized violence. Knight, a former football player and bodyguard, used intimidation and force to build one of the most commercially successful labels of the 1990s. His methods, which included alleged physical assaults on artists and rivals, dangling Vanilla Ice from a hotel balcony to secure publishing rights, and maintaining relationships with Blood's gang members who served as enforcers, represented a new iteration of an old model. The mob had shown that controlling access to venues, airplay, and distribution meant controlling the industry. Knight applied the same logic using different tools, but here is where the story becomes something more than a chronicle of exploitation. The music industry's relationship with organized crime also reveals something about the industry itself. The structures that allowed the mob to thrive, the opacity of royalty accounting, the concentration of power in gatekeepers, the dependence on cash transactions, these were not aberrations. They were features of the system. The mob did not create a corrupt music industry. It found an industry whose structure was perfectly suited to corruption and moved in. The gradual decline of mob influence in the music industry came not from a single dramatic raid or trial, but from structural changes that made the old models obsolete. The digitization of music, beginning with CDs in the 1980s and accelerating with the internet in the late 1990s, undermined the physical distribution networks that had been a key source of mob revenue. You cannot skim from a digital download the way you can skim from a warehouse full of vinyl. The decline of the jukebox, the consolidation of radio under corporate ownership, and the rise of streaming further eroded the choke points that organized crime had exploited. The last major federal case involving organized crime and the music industry was arguably the 2002 conviction of John Gotti Jr., who pleaded guilty to charges that included extortion connected to the entertainment industry. By then, the landscape had changed so fundamentally that the old methods of control were simply no longer viable. Yet the legacy persists. The independent promotion system, though reformed, still operates on principles that trace back to the Payola era. The concentration of power in a handful of major labels, the opacity of streaming royalty calculations, the exploitation of young artists through contracts they do not fully understand. These patterns echo the structures that organized crime helped build and sustain for decades. Tommy James, reflecting on his years under Morris Levy's control, once observed that the music business was the only industry where the weights and measures were never checked. That observation remains uncomfortably relevant. There is an ironic coda to this story. Many of the songs that defined American popular culture, songs that became the soundtrack of weddings, road trips, and summer nights, were produced and distributed through systems tainted by organized crime. The doo-wop groups of the 1950s, many of whom were African-American teenagers from impoverished neighborhoods, were signed to labels run by mob-connected figures who paid them little or nothing while collecting enormous revenues. The Teenagers, featuring Frankie Lyman, recorded Why Do Fools Fall in Love in 1956 for George Goldner's label. Goldner was a compulsive gambler who repeatedly sold his labels to Morris Levy to cover debts. Lyman, who was 13 when he recorded the song, never received adequate royalties and died of a heroin overdose at 25. His story is not unique, it is representative. The music industry's entanglement with organized crime lasted roughly 6 decades, from the early 1930s to the early 1990s. During that time, the mob extracted billions of dollars in revenue, shaped the careers of some of the most famous artists in history, and built structures of control that outlasted the criminals themselves. The story is not one of simple villainy. It is a story about what happens when an industry is built on systems that reward secrecy, concentrate power in gatekeepers, and treat creative people as expendable commodities. The mob did not invent those systems, but it perfected them. And anyone who listens to music today, streaming a song on a phone, attending a concert in a corporate arena, watching an algorithm decide what goes viral, is living in a world that still bears the fingerprints of men who understood, long before anyone else, that controlling music meant controlling money, and controlling money meant controlling people. The next time you hear a classic song from the golden era of American popular music, consider who profited, consider who did not, and consider whether the systems that allowed such profound exploitation have truly been dismantled, or whether they have simply been rebranded, digitized, and made invisible in ways that even the old dons of organized crime could not have imagined.